Hey, good afternoon, good morning, all. Apologies for that brief delay, but we'll get started in just a minute. Ooh, Manju, you're on mute. There you go.
Hi, everyone. So sorry for the technical glitch, but you know, Zoom has to keep us on our feet, doesn't it? Even in our bedrooms and living rooms, keep us waiting. So thanks so much. A few other WhatsApp groups are all also sharing this and are all joining us. I'm just going to give everyone just a minute. Well, it looks like we have a great group, 51 and counting. I am really happy everyone is joining us for this conversation today. I feel like I know everyone here, but in case I don't, Manju Chathani from AVAC, and delighted you could spend the rest of the hour with us. So we have a lot to talk about. So I think we can get going. As we know that we have this call every 2 weeks, so we can come together to share updates about research, but more importantly, discuss what they mean and do some interpretation. We had planned to do a two-part discussion today, tips and tricks on how to figure out what's real and not when we get so much news. And what an interesting day for that conversation with two new pieces of information that have come across our screens today, with a Russian vaccine trial being released without the trials being completed, and some new modeling data that is predicting some pretty dire numbers for deaths in Africa if urgent measures aren't used now. So of course we will send that out to everyone, and if we have some time at the end of this call, we will definitely spend a few minutes discussing these. Kay Marshall was meant to be on this call with us, so she would start us off with tips and tricks about how to figure out what's real and not in all of this. Unfortunately, she's had a family emergency and she can't join us right now. She's fine, but she has to attend to something, and we will make sure that we have Kay help us figure out how to do this. Before we get to the main part of our discussion, I just want to remind us that this is a place for lots of conversation, even though we're not going to ask everyone to introduce themselves here, because then we'll do catch up and we won't get to hydroxychloroquine. Remind you that when it comes time to question, please put your hand up. We'll call on you to ask a question directly, or we'll also be monitoring the chat function. So please put your questions there. So without further ado, hydroxychloroquine, the drug that just won't go away. It keeps coming up in the news. We keep hearing pieces of data, evidence that shows it doesn't work for either treatment or cure, and there's still research going on whether it can be used as PrEP, and yet every so often there are videos or certain politicians who think differently from the evidence, and it gets, it's extremely politicized, and it confuses us. It confuses all of us to figure out what's real and what's not. Do some of these leaders have access to information that we don't, that we keep seeing this doesn't make sense, and yet we see this happening? And we thought, you know what, let's get some folks to help us interpret this. And so I'm extremely excited to introduce Dr. Elizabeth Bukusi from the Kenya Medical Research Council, that many of us know and love, who is going to help us discuss this, and Dr. Sinead Delaney Moretwe from WITS RHI in South Africa, who's been involved in the research with both looking at hydroxychloroquine as treatment and at hydroxychloroquine as PrEP. Both of those arms were actually dropped from research in South Africa. So we're asking her to give us an overview of that research, and what is real and what is not, and what are the questions still to be answered about this drug. and then Dr. Bukusi will help us navigate it. And as I said, as we get to the end of the call, hopefully we'll have a little bit more time to also talk about this new data. So actually, I'd love to hand over to you, Dr. Bukusi, to just kind of set the stage, and then we'll have Sinead give us the overview of the research. So over to you, Elizabeth.
Thank you very much. Apologies that Sinead and I seem to have joined a little late. We're on a link where it seemed like it was just the two of us, and we're happily talking to each other, waiting for everyone else to get on, and we couldn't figure out why the rest of you had not gotten on. So it's good to finally be in the group. So Manju, I'm assuming that you've already done the first part of it, and you've already heard all the other aspects that are going to be discussed, the tips and tricks.
So yeah, what you did miss, unfortunately, Elizabeth, is that Kay Marshall, who was going to do that piece for us, she had a family emergency and has been called away. She's fine, but she's been called away. So we're going to postpone that for another time, and we're going to dive right into the world of hydroxychloroquine.
Okay, thank you very much. So it's such a great pleasure for me to introduce Sinead, because she has been somebody whom I've admired for many years as a person working in the field of HIV prevention, and I've had the joy and privilege of actually working in some specific studies with her. So Sinead, if I started talking about all the things you've done and just the wonderful work that you've been doing, we probably won't have enough time to talk about hydroxychloroquine. So I'm sure people will be able to look you up and just see the kind of work you've been leading and the many things you have done that have made a difference to the lives of many, many people. So Sinead, let me just invite you to go ahead and start the conversation by just telling us about hydroxychloroquine, the studies you've been involved in, what they were trying to prove, and then go ahead and tell us why it is that those specific studies are not currently ongoing. So Sinead, over to you, please.
Thanks very much, Elizabeth, and thanks very much, Manju, for the opportunity to talk to people. I am aware that chloroquine is a very politicized topic, and I hope that we can bring some science to the conversation. I will say that, kind of what I really want to share is the journey that we took with chloroquine as a strategy for pre-exposure prophylaxis for healthcare workers. But at Wits RHI, we were also involved in the WHO Solidarity treatment trials, where chloroquine was originally an arm of those trials. And if we sort of roll back to, I think it was probably May, probably from about March, when the world suddenly blew up, there was a huge effort to identify potential interventions for COVID, either as treatment or prophylaxis. And one of the drugs that appeared to be promising was chloroquine. It does have antiviral effects in vitro, so in the laboratory. And it was identified through various screening libraries. It has also been sort of thought of previously to have antiviral effects and has been tried with other viruses, although to no effect. So in part because of the need for a rapid response, the advantage of chloroquine is that it could be repurposed. It's been used for, I think, something like 70 years in many people with a large safety database. And so, it was one of the drugs that people jumped to. For us in the African region and low and middle income countries, it was an attractive drug because we were familiar with it for malaria treatment and prophylaxis. And it was going to be relatively inexpensive. And so it was attractive as an intervention that could be scaled up. But then one of the first things that we started to hear were concerns about safety. This was primarily in treatment trials where they were using doses that were sort of above doses that would be used in prophylaxis. And a lot of the concern was really about cardiac side effects. And I think we heard, for example, the study from Brazil where they stopped the very high doses. And that generated a lot of anxiety then about, whether chloroquine could be used safely. A lot of the reasons that were articulated for those cardiac side effects were because they were used in people who were acutely ill. They were used in combination with other drugs that also kind of together can cause cardiac side effects. They were used in high doses, and they were used in people who had comorbidities. And that was really the explanation for why there might be higher risk. And then you will recall that, kind of there was then a lot of what is the word, negative publicity around that Lancet article that was presented, which really showed these side effects, and subsequently that was retracted. And I think that that caused a huge amount of confusion. And practically speaking, for the treatment trials, it meant that they paused and they withdrew chloroquine. And then, kind of after that article was sort of found to be flawed and was retracted, those arms were reinstated. But shortly thereafter, I think there was a kind of convergence of evidence, which really, I think, made it harder for many regulatory authorities to approve the continuation of these treatment trials. And the MHRA in the UK was one of the first to suspend any trials with chloroquine, but a number of regulatory authorities followed afterwards. And so they said it wasn't actually concerns about safety, it was concerns about futility. So that, kind of really there began to sort of be this accumulation of data which suggested that maybe chloroquine wouldn't be useful. So I'll try and take you through that data very quickly without getting too bogged down. But I think sort of the bottom line is that we didn't really see in any of the treatment trials evidence that chloroquine was clearing virus. One of the arguments was that it was being given too late in the COVID disease progression, at the point at which people were already kind of very ill, and that it might not have had any antiviral effects. But, kind of that's already not a good sign if you're doing, for us who were thinking about prophylaxis, if you're thinking about prevention, you really want to see that a drug is having antiviral effects. And so that wasn't a good sign. But the arguments were, well, maybe if you use it earlier in disease, or maybe if you use it for prevention, kind of you could see an effect. But then we had data published from two studies, one in Minnesota and one subsequently in Barcelona, where they used chloroquine for post-exposure prophylaxis, and the effects were really modest. So in terms of preventing infection, really around effects of around 10%, and in terms of preventing clinical disease, very small effects. And, kind of when we thought about this from the prophylaxis point of view, it would have meant really giving 100 people chloroquine in order to prevent one infection. So it started to become an intervention that might not be that useful. And then always when you go into a trial, we look at not just, we try to look at a number of data sources. So, did we have biological plausibility? And what we got then was data from animal studies done by the NIH in non-human primates and hamsters, which also suggested no antiviral effects to prevent virus. And then there was also some further studies done by scientists in the laboratory, basically showing that although on early lab studies, chloroquine did have effects in lung tissue, that it's really important the type of cells that are used to demonstrate that. And in fact, there wasn't good uptake of chloroquine in the particular cells in the lung which needed the drug. So that was yet another reason why we became less hopeful. And then there was also data published, or the FDA released a notice suggesting that, again, it wasn't optimal data, it wasn't necessarily the right cells or sort of the right tissue to do these studies, but laboratory studies suggested that there might be drug interactions between remdesivir and chloroquine. So that's not optimal for treatment, but also for prophylaxis, because it would be a long-acting drug. You don't want to give someone chloroquine, and then if they do get COVID, you don't want them not to be able to benefit from remdesivir. So that was a concern, although there didn't seem to be interactions between chloroquine and dexamethasone. And so I think in summary, those data plus a systematic review which didn't show that there was much evidence to support then chloroquine for either treatment or prevention. I think a number of investigators as well as a number of regulatory authorities basically said, you know, kind of these trials shouldn't continue because they're likely to be futile. And so that was the reason why in South Africa we then paused the development of the Crown Coronation trial and basically removed chloroquine from that trial, which is a trial of prophylaxis in healthcare workers, and are actually looking at other interventions. So just to summarize, I think we have data from laboratory data, animal data, data from treatment studies, and data from PEP studies, which all suggested that chloroquine was not having the antiviral effects that you would have hoped for either treatment or prevention. And so that's the reason why people have pivoted away, although I would agree that those trials that are ongoing are at least trying to sort of deliver some answers, but there has generally, I think, been a shift away from a belief that chloroquine will be helpful. And this is not surprising because it's very similar to what we saw with other viruses where chloroquine was originally thought to potentially have a benefit.
Thank you very much, Sinead, for really providing us with the information that helps us think through why hydrochloroquine was considered and why currently it's not in the treatment trials. I did see some hands already start to go up, but the hands went down. So this is a good opportunity for us to start this discussion. As Manju clearly told us earlier when she was introducing us to this, there's been a lot of discussion and there's been videos that are, flooding the WhatsApp messages to say, well, maybe it works. Somebody used it in whatever number of patients and they say it worked. All their patients recovered. Nobody had any challenges. So let's start with Catherine. Catherine Kripke, you have your hand up. You've already unmuted. Please go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, thanks. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, you're loud and clear, Catherine.
Okay, nice to see you. So one of the things that I've heard, through the social internet with a lot of healthcare workers are talking about this in the US, is that, and I haven't looked at the science of this at all, but I've heard that hydroxychloroquine, its mechanism of action is to help zinc get into cells. And so they're saying that they need to test it with zinc, and that, without that, they don't know whether blah, blah, blah. So can you comment on that?
Yeah, this idea actually that zinc may be useful as an antiviral, and there is some evidence from sort of studies of influenza and other respiratory viruses that have shown that zinc may be helpful in sort of mitigating, I think, the consequences of those viruses. But the idea is for zinc to get into a cell, you need something called an ionophore, which is basically a transport molecule that transport the zinc from inside to outside, from outside to inside of the cell. And chloroquine has been found to be an ionophore. But there are other ionophores apart from chloroquine. One of them is quercetin. It's apparently also a medication that can be, it's sort of one of these nutraceuticals. So it doesn't have to be chloroquine that is used to get zinc into a cell. And that would just be if chloroquine were being used as an ionophore. Originally, the idea was that actually we need combinations. And so the combination of zinc with its antiviral effects and chloroquine with its antiviral effects could have benefit. But now we don't really think that chloroquine will have a benefit, and arguably we should perhaps choose an ionophore that has a better safety profile than chloroquine if we think that zinc is worth evaluating as either for treatment or prevention.
Morenike has a question, Sinead. Morenike is asking, what about quinine? Is there any thoughts on the use of quinine for the management of severe COVID-19?
So I have heard from colleagues at MMV, which is Medicines for Malaria, which works a lot in West Africa, that there is some interesting data that's emerging about amidiaquin, which is also an anti-malarial. So there continues to be interest in this idea of repurposing products, but also repurposing anti-malarials. And I believe that there are some people who may be looking at amidiaquin sort of in the kind of at the moment. I don't know whether they're going into trials yet, but you know, kind of there's this constant interest in looking at drugs that we already have evidence of safety for, and whether they might have anti-SARS-CoV-2 effects.
Thank you, Sinead. Yvette Raphael, you have your hand up. Would you like to ask your question, please, Yvette?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks, AVAC and Manju, for organizing the call. Because I am just Yvette, I have to go where I feel we are afraid to go. Do we think us as a group and scientists are equipped enough to speak against two of the world's most powerful leaders? The President of the United States is taking chloroquine, and some African countries, and some in South Africa too, thinks because chloroquine is so easily available, we are just part of a bigger plot in politics. I want us to talk about the reality. The science makes sense to me, but it does not. I don't have enough resources to explain to everyone who needs to know why did Bolsonaro take chloroquine and he's okay, and why is Donald Trump taking chloroquine and he's okay? Is the science equipped to fight the leadership? Some African countries, that drug chloroquine is 40 rand. It's available, it's accessible. Can we be real and talk how difficult it is for us as activists to go against that with communities where people see so many people dying, so many people struggling to breathe, and the leaders are able to just take chloroquine and be okay? And scientists, are we equipped enough, and are we giving advocates enough equipment to deal with this big scandal? It's scandalous, it's political, it makes me worry, it makes me hang my head in shame as an activist for research that I don't know who is right and who is wrong. The people in the community don't know the politics, they hardly care. All they see is people are dying, and Bolsonaro didn't die, Donald Trump took the drug. What do we say?
Thank you, Yvette. I think let's take a couple more so that, now the hands are really going up. Let me take at least two more questions, and then we'll try and take them all together. So thank you, Yvette, for raising that question. With all due respect, I would say, even as I take the next question, whenever a politician tells me they're doing something, I always want to know, where's the evidence that they're really doing it? Because when we talk about science, we talk about evidence-based, that if you say you're taking something, we want the proof that you're taking it. I could tell you I'm taking anything, and the question is, can you even prove what I'm taking or not taking? But Kenneth, you're up next. Let's hear your question. Let's take the next four, and then we'll try and answer all these together. It will be both Sinead and some of the AVAC team will also chime in on this. So Kenneth, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thanks, Sinead, for sharing thoughts around hydroxide chloroquine. My question is, do you think, and any of us on the call could answer this, I know there's a lot we don't know around COVID, but do you think that countries that have been prone to malaria, like my country, Uganda, and the use of medicines like chloroquine in the early years or these other antimalarials has a relationship in building an immune system within our bodies? Because we see this in my country, at least the data we have, about 90% of the cases we've had are asymptomatic, and actually COVID just clears out of them without any intervention. And I've been wondering whether there is that relationship because of a lot of anti-malarial use in my country has any effects on how our body responds to COVID. Thank you.
Thank you, Kenneth. Ntando, let's hear your question before we try and answer them. Ntando?
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Thank you, Sinead. And I think I want to take it, to add to Yvette's question and probably push it further outside politics as an addition and ask if there is any debate or even any disagreement in the medical field. And in fact, is the medical field really divided between research, which I think speaks to the evidence that you speak to, Elizabeth, but also the fact that you also now, we are seeing, you know, the field where medical doctors are basically, you know, wanting to prove their standpoints. So how do we navigate those disagreements that we see? And regardless of the fact that there might be a political influence themselves, but I think it's still, to go back to Yvette's question, it still remains a question about, you know, if we see a doctor who then is suggesting, you know, the opposite from what we, you know, for instance, Sinead is telling us.
Okay, so let's stop it there for the moment. I can see we still have 2 hands up, and we will come back to you. Keep your hands up. I'll come back to you. Sinead, I'll let you answer any that you'd wish to answer, and then I will also open it up to others to contribute.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're great questions, and I think sort of, you know, kind of science is not divorced from politics. I mean, there are many instances where science goes up against strong beliefs that people have that, you know, are not grounded in science. You know, we live in a post-truth world where, you know, we see this with anti-vaccine commentary. We see this around climate change. So this way of sort of talking about things is not unique to SARS-CoV-2. It's just kind of one of the latest embodiments, I think, of where science has to, you know, kind of deal with some of these conversations. And I think for scientists, it's true that it's quite challenging because we have rules of our game, and I don't think that sometimes the people we're talking to necessarily play by our rules. But I mean, fundamentally, I think it's important that if we're going to use chloroquine in public health programs and we're going to use public dollars to pay for chloroquine, we need to have adequate evidence to support those decisions. And at this stage, the evidence is weak, such that normative agencies like WHO have decided not to continue with their evaluations for treatment, and that you know, kind of there are countries and regulatory authorities that have said they don't think the evidence is strong enough to continue some trials that are evaluating chloroquine. And those are public institutions that do follow the rules of science. And in the end, I suppose, as a patient or as a healthcare worker, I'd like to know that the interventions that are being recommended to me are safe, but also that they're going to work. So that's this first point. I think the second point is that's never stopped people using drugs off-label. I mean, we have multiple examples of where drugs are used off-label, sometimes for good indications, but sometimes not. But and just because one person doesn't experience harm doesn't necessarily prove that all people won't experience harm if, you know, kind of on average, large groups of people use that drug. So I don't think the examples of Trump or Bolsonaro, you know, kind of really disprove what we know, which is that maybe, you know, these drugs are not going to be safe in all people and they're not going to be particularly effective. But I do think we have to get better at articulating this and saying why we want evidence-based interventions and why we want evidence-based policy. and we need to kind of be clearer to articulate that it's it's not a sufficient experiment or proof to have one guy tell us that it works and for us to believe it. We would prefer to follow the rigors of science and the way that drugs are normally assessed, I think, in order to get them into policy. Just to the point about immunity, I think it's an interesting idea, this idea that widespread use of chloroquine might have a protective benefit. I think it's more likely that there are other reasons, just because, I don't think that chloroquine works by altering people's immune responses, although it does have some sort of dampening of the acute inflammatory response in SARS-CoV-2. I think what's more likely, and what we're seeing sort of from studies that are being published, is that people who've been exposed to coronaviruses probably do have some cross protection against SARS-CoV-2, and that, kind of also in places like Africa, we have anticipated that with younger populations, those people generally experience less severe forms of the disease, and that's why we may be seeing higher rates of asymptomatic infection. But I would also say that my own country is an example of what the rest of the region could experience. We thought we were doing well with very hard lockdowns and low numbers, and now we've passed, I think, 500,000 cases. We've had large numbers of deaths, and I think that, kind of what we're beginning to see in other parts of the region is just the beginning. So I wouldn't get too complacent, and I really think, kind of a lot of what we're able to do to prevent SARS-CoV-2 have been up until now the non-pharmacological interventions, and we really need to push those in places like Africa, where we do not have strong healthcare resources. And then my last point would be just that this is also why we need precisely why we need prophylaxis interventions, and there are a number of trials looking at other prophylactic interventions, and ultimately why we need specific trials of specific vaccines. And in the end, as advocates, I think rather than having arguments with people about whether chloroquine does or doesn't work, part of it is to shift the conversation to where we want to go and to focus people perhaps on the other bright, shiny things that need to be developed. Because, in my experience of talking to anti-vaxxers or the like, sometimes you need to not focus on changing an old idea, but shift to a new idea. And I think sort of to try to keep on message about why it's important that we need evidence for interventions that we want to expand at scale in large numbers of people. So those are just my thoughts. And sorry, I took a little bit long to answer those questions.
That was perfectly okay, Sinead. You needed to take the time required. And I want to open it up in case anyone else wants to add to this before we go to the next questions. But let me just emphasize what you did say, Sinead, that from a medical point of view, medical doctors can make a recommendation for a treatment, even if it is not necessarily approved for that specific item or by that specific disease. But they should look at it from an individual point of view and think, for this particular patient I have before me, I think they may benefit, and therefore I want to recommend it for them. But from a public health point of view, in order to recommend any treatment or any prophylaxis, we do need evidence that tells us it is safe and it is appropriate and it does make a difference for any particular treatment to be given, whether it is for treatment purposes or for prophylaxis or prevention. In the absence of that, for a medical community, it would be very difficult to recommend anything. Now, the rules of the political engagement are very different from the rules of medical science engagement. And so someone can recommend something based on what they think and what they want or what they think is appropriate, but they may not necessarily use the same rules of engagement. So as Sinead is saying, we need to recognize in which arena are we talking and what are we using as our rules of engagement. I want to take the next few questions, and if anyone else has something they wanted to add to it, I hope that you will flag it, and I can see there are also some comments in the chat that we will get to. Now, the next person who has their hand up, unfortunately, you haven't labeled yourself, so the best I can do is say the person who signed in as iPhone, would you like to ask your question? Because I don't have a name to call out. And then Rosemary will follow, and then Morenike can then also take the floor. So whoever's signed in as iPhone, would you like to ask your question or make your comment?
Okay, sorry. My name is Queen B from Zimbabwe. I'm in AVAC PX Raw TG. I just wanted to ask, because especially here in Africa, we're having a challenge of many people coming up with many different methods. But I wanted to ask, especially on, has there been any engagement with the traditional healers, especially for the African side? Scientists and traditional healers seated together and trying to find a common ground, because right now it's more of like somebody saying use this and somebody saying use this. And you know, the African way, when we are talking about our medicine, we don't have the right, what we call the right proportion to say that you are taking a 2 tablespoons or you're taking what? You just take a whole pot of water. So I think it's also good necessary for us to hear it, that scientists have sat down with traditional healers and how they're coming up with it.
Thank you for that question. Rosemary Mburu, you go next, please.
Thank you so much, Prof. So I have 2 comments and 1 question. 1 comment is that this really is a timely conversation because it points to the broader issue of research literacy, particularly we as research advocates, and just seeing how we are also kind of struggling with this topic. And then you can imagine what is happening out there among the general public. And therefore, this is a very timely conversation. The second one is that it seems to me that it might be a time bomb, especially just because we have data. We know that there's data showing that it has no benefit for either prevention or treatment. But I wonder if we have any data, and maybe Sinead, you've talked about this, that shows the potential harmful effects of the drug. Because if then that be the case, and we see a lot of physicians in our spaces are prescribing this, then what that might mean, even in the long term for the health system, where we then end up with serious complications. So I think I'll just leave it at that for now.
Thank you very much, Rosemary. Morenike, Dr. Morenike.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And I want to take something from what Jeanette said, which is about shifting the conversation. And I think for me, and from what I pulled from the many discussions in the chat box, is how we as advocates can handle this. Just to share that for me, I think the priority in our advocacy at this time of controversy is to reinforce the belief in science. I think our advocacy work cannot take away the value of science, no matter what we do. If that is the shift in conversation we are going to make, it's about reinforcing the belief in the data about science. And I think this is also very important. Rosemary was talking about side effects. We are already, in my own country, one of the things you've seen is because of the false news, the cost of hydroxychloroquine has gone up. It's about $200 right now, something that was less than $5. But hospitals are already managing hydroxychloroquine toxicity because people are taking it. Everybody's taking it. No, there is no dose at all. So, and people are just taking this because there is no evidence for what it is, so there's no dose. So for me, I think one of the things we might want to go back in terms of building on the lesson from today is to enhance our research literacy competency and help people shift conversation in ways that we would not undermine science as a result of this controversies around hydroxychloroquine or every other thing around COVID-19. Thank you.
Thank you. Eric Mcheka, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Bukusi and Sinead, for your presentation. I am Eric Mcheka from Malawi. Yeah, on the issue about hydrochloroquine, I remember 3 weeks ago, one of the doctors from a private hospital wrote more like an advice to his fellow doctors to administer hydrochloroquine to anybody showing signs, COVID-19 signs. And this message went viral. And now I'm imagining with the data that SNID has presented, that unless it's used as a prophylaxis, otherwise it's not hydrochloroquine. It's not the medication, or it should not be administered. How best as advocates do we handle this now, considering that uh, in Africa, not many people have access to the kind of information that we are privileged to have had today, and I should believe out there are people that are, especially doctors, that are still administering this medication, especially in private hospitals. So how best do we counter this? Do we counter this information? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to pass it back to Sinead to answer some questions, but just to sort of touch on what you've just raised, Eric, and this has been raised by some of the speakers before you. I think the reminder about the need for research literacy goes beyond just the population and everybody who's in the world, so to speak. I think often even the medical personnel, we take it for granted that they have a very clear idea of the research enterprise and what's required as evidence before something goes into practice. And often doctors and other clinicians will assume if I used it on one patient and it works, that's good enough, I can recommend it for everybody else. Because many of them may not necessarily think of the level of evidence required before public health interventions, or indeed before medication can be recommended for any specific treatment. And they assume that personal individualized use for a patient is equivalent to public health interventions for wider use. Sinead, let me allow you to respond to the questions that you would like to respond to, and then we can open it up for some more discussion.
Yeah, these are great comments, and it's a really good conversation. You know, just while you were talking, I went to look on clinicaltrials.gov, and there are 14 studies that are still recruiting people into trials using chloroquine either for treatment or prophylaxis. So there are still people interested in this idea, but I think it's interesting that some of the trials that kind of started are not being listed there. So I think as evidence accumulates, we'll find that there are fewer trials that are recruiting. So that's just sort of an observation. You know, I think what people are talking about just listening is that, you know, kind of particularly in our region, there's a huge, a lot of stock is set by what the doctor says. There's a kind of, people really trust medical professionals. And I know that, you know, I saw one of the viral videos of all these doctors in white coats making these claims. And I'm sure, you know, for the ordinary person on the street, you know, it's hard to counter that, which is why I sort of agree that part of it is maybe to encourage people to ask questions about where the information is coming from and what purpose it's serving, and whether there are alternative views. And in some ways it gets to sort of, I think, how we teach our kids to understand what's fake news and what's not. And maybe those are some of the conversations we need to have. Who's telling us this? Why are they telling us this? Why is it important that they're telling us this now? Are there other people that are telling us something different? What's the difference between the two groups? As a way to kind of help people weigh up the evidence. And I think also to kind of direct people to trusted sources of information. There are a number of websites that are constantly reviewing the evidence for what does and doesn't work, or what's being used for treatment, and perhaps to direct people to those sources of information. So WHO provides information, the NIH has treatment guidelines, but they're also, I saw a great website for pharmacists that is being reporting on all sorts of interventions, so that people can at least, you know, kind of make some informed decisions perhaps, or kind of weigh the thoughts themselves. Just on chloroquine, One of the comments has been that, you know, kind of we made a classic mistake that we often make in medicine, which is to foreclose too rapidly, and everyone jumped on chloroquine and no one investigated anything else. And I think one of the things to comment on is that perhaps there's been an overinvestment in chloroquine, and perhaps we do, and that's another thing that advocates can start doing is kind of encouraging people to look at, you know, kind of the need to investigate alternatives besides chloroquine, because not everyone will be able to use chloroquine. So that's another thought. And then I think just on the conversation about side effects, I absolutely agree that, you know, kind of that's that two of the points that we made about why we need to do these trials is that we need to also find if these drugs don't work, we shouldn't be taking them away from people who need them. So people who have rheumatoid arthritis or people who do have malaria. And that may be a helpful argument to make with other people, is just to say we shouldn't be taking drugs from people who actually need them. And then the last point just about traditional healers, I think it's an interesting point. And maybe it's another point about the types of research we need. So we need trials, but also part of these drug libraries have really, and some of these other studies have really been looking at other products that might have anti-SARS-CoV-2 activity. There are some registry studies, so asking people whether they are using particular drugs and sampling them in order to kind of identify compounds that people might be taking that do seem on average to be protecting them. And included in some of those questions are questions about traditional medicines. So I think there isn't an awareness about engaging. And I think I'm aware that in China, where the pandemic emerged, there were, you know, kind of in some ways that was sort of also part of the discussion about some of the traditional medicines that have been used that could potentially have benefit. But a lot of the scanning of those products requires demonstrating biological effects, demonstrating the you know, kind of these associations between people who use them and lower infection rates. And it's often a long walk from uncontrolled or specified compounds through to drugs that are developed. But certainly, you know, kind of traditional healers should be included in these discussions because they may have important observations.
Mitch, you're unmuted. Did you want to add to the conversation?
No. I'm delighted to listen.
Okay. So I thought you might have wanted to say something, but let me just go back to something that somebody said. I don't see any hands up right now, but Manju, maybe you can check in the chat if there's something specific that we do want to flag in the last few minutes that we have. But I do want to go back to something somebody said and said, what, I think it is Yvette, and you said, well, what powers do we have? These are presidents of countries, presidents of very powerful countries that are making these claims. And, you know, what can we as advocates do? Now, I've lived long enough that when I was in medical school and in my early medical career, that's when HIV was first being identified and we didn't have any treatment. And having seen how far we have come and how much has changed, and that people have been able to get onto treatment, and that we have people who have been able to live with HIV and live a productive life and really gone on to do everything that they may have wanted to do, that I've seen babies survive, some not get infected, some, despite infection, living successful lives and being able to accomplish anything they could have accomplished. I think advocates have a lot of power. And I think you're underestimating the power of advocacy to bring about real change. If anything, I was hoping you would say, what can we do? And what must we do? And what should we do to be able to make a difference? Because just because somebody claims it doesn't absolutely mean that it is true. Yvette, I can see your hand went straight up the moment I started talking about advocacy. So we have just a few minutes left. What would you want to say?
No, I totally agree with you. And I agree with using our history for HIV, but as an advocate, I would say totally different. The beginning of HIV is something we should never repeat. And like Jim, I feel we are using HIV and saying we've learned at the end, but after how many lives were lost? So as an advocate who lived through that, I don't want to see that. And now my struggle is just around, I know the science, I know how to transfer it, but I want advocates, scientists to come up with better ways of engaging early in this disease. Yeah, we can't continue using HIV. It's painful. We lost too many lives. What can we do to ensure that we don't repeat the mistakes of HIV, especially when governments are at the forefront of being the denialist about the disease? It was okay with South Africa. We went all out after Mantu and Thabo Mbeki. I'd like to see the same spirit go after the presidents who are continuing using this false claim. If we're sure it's false, let's go after it and let people know that they shouldn't be using hydroxychloroquine. HCQ, it's a tongue twister for me, but yes, I just feel we need to work together with scientists, but scientists need to give us a little bit more than to say we know the science, we know this, we shouldn't repeat it.
Thanks, Yvette. Mitch, you do have your hand up now.
I do. Both what you said, Elizabeth, and Yvette both prompted. And I think some of what you said, Yvette's so true, goes back to something, Sinead, you said earlier on that I just think really, for me, underscores a lot of this. And there are some minds that we won't entirely change, and actually it often reinforces these alternate views, but rather what are the new ideas? And I really was taken by that comment today. And I think you're right, Yvette. There are a lot of, I wish hydroxychloroquine were the only issue in the US president's perspective that we're wrong. I wish that were, because frankly, it's not the worst thing that's happening right now. Doesn't mean it's not a problem, but I think this idea of what as advocates we can be pushing for, and I'm really struck by, individual practitioners can prescribe off-label, individuals can choose to use products. Those are things we certainly want to help inform, but one thing we as advocates can do is hold regulatory agencies and normative bodies to account, which I think, and Sinead, you described it well, they're doing some of that already. I mean, FDA and WHO have given us the ammunition to be able to say, these are facts, that some individuals will still take the drugs, some providers will still prescribe, but we can hold them to account. I think it relates also to the larger set of issues of what else is in development. We don't want products made available because people hope they work or think they work. This is not faith-based public health. And I think you heard at the top, Manju, describing the decision today of the Russian government to license a vaccine on no data at all. That's not fake news. That's actually real news. It really happened, and it's really worrisome. And we need to make sure that no other country goes down that path of letting politics and hope drive the response and drive product approvals. And we don't want it in WHO guidelines. We obviously do want treatments. We do want vaccines. I think for us, or at least for me as an advocate, holding people to account for going as fast as they can while preserving the things that are required to ensure that products are safe and effective. And again, that's not going to stop a president in Brazil or the United States from saying stupid things or using products that have no evidence. But from a public health perspective, we can, as advocates, make sure that the normative bodies and the regulatory agencies do what they're mandated to do, follow the science, and then as advocates use our voices to say, this is what does work, this is what doesn't, and really drive it. I realize that doesn't address the issue of it at all, but for me, I think becoming even more aggressive regulatory and normative agency advocates, raising our literacy about those issues, may be our greatest tools to ensure that only safe and effective interventions are actually rolled out in public health programs, knowing that providers are going to do things and politicians are going to do things as well. So I'm not sure that, I realize it's very small comfort, but I guess that's for me what I take away from a lot of this. And I know I have to jump at the top of the call, but just want to say, oh, and Tando, you asked, basically, the Russian government, just so everyone is aware, today approved for use amongst frontline workers, health workers, and the military, actually an approved vaccine developed by a Russian agency using adeno-vectors. The efficacy trial is not even enrolling and does not have any data yet. Earlier small phase 1 trials showed that it was safe, but that's true of now almost 30 products. We've seen this too in China about a month ago. They didn't approve a vaccine, but the Chinese military did authorize the use of the vaccine for their members of the military. Again, neither of those products, the Chinese or the Russian products, have gone through what we know to be the absolute necessary steps to demonstrate safety and efficacy. And it's hugely worrisome, particularly the Russian product using the adenovector. Those who remember back to the STEP trial in HIV, there is some evidence that some vaccines, and particularly adeno 5, did actually turn on the immune system in a bad way with respect to HIV. So there's even greater reason to worry about the adeno 5 vaccine that is part of the Russian combination. So hopefully that's a quick sense of what's happened there. And again, one that we just need to make sure that we don't let speed and urgency and desperation overtake the systems that we need desperately.
Thanks,
Sorry, I went on too long. Go
no,
ahead,
that's all right.
Elizabeth, we can't hear you. You're muted.
I apologize. On that note, because we have run out of time, Sinead, I want to just give you the last word. Thank you so much for really throwing a lot of light onto this. Before I turn it back to Manju, any last word, Sinead?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I was thinking about is that we're spending a lot of time on chloroquine, but I think where where trials and science did work well was dexamethasone. And I think, again, sort of making sure that products that have been shown to be effective are being used in the health system. Those, again, are places to point for where science has worked. I've been watching everything on the chat, and I agree that it is these are challenging conversations to have. But I think what Mitchell says makes absolute sense to me. I think part of it is over the years, I think I've learned that the important thing is to kind of provide an alternative set of ideas for those people who are in the middle. There are going to be people on this side and people on this side, and you may not change their view, but a lot of people will, kind of take some of your information and use it. And we have to talk to them and engage them and give them the tools to make some informed decisions without trying to kind of be distracted by those people on either end who are unlikely to change their minds. So I wish you all the best. I think this is a great conversation. I'm happy to come back and talk about some other ideas some other time. But take care, everyone, and thanks very much for the invitation.
Thank you very much, Sinead. And so I'll wrap it up and hand over back to Manju, just saying that I think advocates play a very important role. And if you know the truth, and that was part of what this conversation was about, just bringing the facts on the table. What do we know? Lab studies, animal studies, studies that have been done on human beings. And once we do know that we have some evidence that either there's futility, it doesn't work, or in high doses, there was some level of toxicity that was seen. In other words, it was causing harm. And that there was a level of, even if we think that it might be helpful, one needs to know what dose, how often, how long, how frequently do you take it? And when all that is unknown, you cannot recommend a product for use. So when you know the facts, you have power because you have the information that can help you change your sphere of influence to be able to make a difference. Manju, let me hand it over back to you so you can wrap it and close us out.
Really, there's very little to say except thank you so much to Sinead and to Elizabeth for really helping us sift through some of this and for the really fantastic conversation here. It's obvious that we're countering this kind of information on a daily basis. And what makes it really complicated is all the conspiracy theories that kind of confound it. That we are keeping drugs away from one population or another, or there's information that some folks have versus another. And I think that so beautifully described by so many folks over here is that we can't change everyone's opinion, but we can keep our eye focused on the evidence, on what science is telling us, to really continue to fill the space with what's real and what's ahead of us, and keep the focus on that. But that, as Yvette has reminded us by continuing to raise this and all the discussion around it, that as advocates, we do this in so many ways with misinformation that comes in HIV, in TB work, and now in COVID, and that we really can be doing a lot more and just focusing in always on the evidence. And one of the things that we've heard from many on this call is that we should have one of these discussions specifically on debunking the myths and sifting through what is real and what is not, and maybe not just a 15-minute discussion like we were going to have Kay to do. So maybe we will have Kay and Ida, who are doing this work in real time with journalists and other media practitioners, about how to sift through what's fake, what's real, what's a preprint, what's a peer-reviewed journal, and to help us all sort through that. So we will definitely get to that another time. The recording of this will be available for everyone. And the issue on hydroxychloroquine is definitely not closed. We'll continue to have more discussion. So we will definitely all be continuing that. And just finally, again, thanking Elizabeth and Sinead, and we will definitely be calling on you to join these conversations again. So thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your week.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.